This is the fable. Again, this was written in 1896, so things haven't changed much. This is the fable of the preacher who flew his kite, but not because he wished to do so. A certain preacher became wise to the fact that he was not making a hit with his congregation. The parishioners did not seem inclined to seek him out after services and tell him how great he was. He suspected that they were rapping him on the quiet. Now, the preacher knew that there must be something wrong with his talk. He'd been trying to expound in a clear and straightforward manner, omitting foreign quotations, setting up for illustration of his points such historical characters as were familiar to his hearers, putting the stubby Old English words ahead of the Latin, and rather flying low along the intellectual plane of the aggregation that chipped in to pay his salary. But the pew holders were not tickled. They could understand everything he said, so they began to think he was common and was not saying anything important. So he studied the situation and decided that if he wanted to win them and make everybody believe he was a knobby and boss minister, he would have to hand out a little guff. So he fixed it up good and plenty. On the following Sunday morning, he got up on the lookout and he read a text that didn't mean anything, read from either direction. Then he sized up his flock with a dreamy eye and said the following: "We cannot more adequately voice the poetry and mysticism of our text than in the familiar lines of the great Icelandic poet Ikan Navarajic. And I quote, 'To hold is not to have, under the seared firmament where chaos sweeps and vast futurity sneers at these puny aspirations, there is the full reprisal.'" Well, when the preacher concluded this extract from the well-known Icelandic poet, he paused and looked downward, breathing heavily through his nose like Camille in the third act. A stout woman in the front row put on her eyeglasses and leaned forward so as not to miss anything. A venerable harness dealer over at the right nodded his head solemnly. He seemed to recognize the quotation. Members of the congregation glanced to one another as if to say, "Hey, this is certainly hot stuff." The preacher wiped his brow and said he had no doubt that everyone within the sound of his voice remembered what Quirinius had said, following the same line of thought. It was Quirinius who disputed the contention of the great Persian theologian Razmatuk that the soul, in its reaching out after the unknowable, was guided by the spiritual genesis of motive rather than by mere impulse of mentality. The preacher didn't know what all this meant, and he didn't care, but you can rest easy that the pew holders were on it in a minute. He talked it off just the way that Cyrano talks when he gets Roxanne so dizzy that she nearly falls off the piazza. The parishioners bit their lower lips and hungered for more first-class language. They had paid their money for tall talk, and they were prepared to solve any and all styles of delivery. They held onto the cushions and seemed to be having a great time. The preacher then quoted copiously from the great poet Amoebius. He cited 18 lines of Greek and then said, "How true it is." And not a parishioner batted an eye. It was Amoebius whose immortal lines he recited in order to prove the extreme error of the position assumed on the controversy by the famous Italian Polenta. He had him going, and there wasn't a thing he could do from there on in. Just ride downhill. He sank his voice to the whisper. He talked about the birds and the beads. And then, although there was no cue for him to weep, he shed a few tears up there on the platform, and there wasn't a dry glove in the church. After he sat down, he could tell by the scared look of the people in front that he had made a 10 strike. Yes, from that moment on, his congregation grew and grew. The pew holders, of course, wouldn't admit to themselves that the preacher had rung in a lot of new ones that they never heard of. They stood pat. They said it was an elegant sermon. Perceiving that they would stand for anything, the preacher knew what to do after that, and he did it. The moral is, give the people what they think they want.